Right now on X, there's a lot of conversation about the alleged failure of the Nintendo GameCube, right? Everybody on there is shocked that like the GameCube didn't sell very well and that the PS2 vastly outperformed it. Like, no, how could the GameCube fail? Everybody I know talks about it. Everyone I know loves the GameCube. Everyone still plays it. Yeah, because you cannot evaluate the success of a product based on how much it sold. This is the thing people don't like admitting when it comes to like the console wars. This is the reason why people like talking about like rising and declining sales of platforms are completely and utterly like insane and out of touch with reality, right? People don't like admitting that simply selling a lot of units doesn't make your platform good, right? When you compare the GameCube with the PS2, it's very obvious that the GameCube has remained much more relevant. It has had much more successful follow ups. It introduced a ton of unique IPs to gaming. It is absolutely, monumentally an example of how having higher sales numbers doesn't make you more successful, right? Because when you really break it down to brass tacks, when you really examine the reason why PS2 sold more, it always comes down to the same thing. PS2 was a DVD player and PS2 marketed itself to normies, right? People who didn't play video games bought a PS2 because it's like, oh, it's the thing that everyone's buying. That's why I had one, was because someone bought it for me who didn't know anything about video games and I didn't care about them, but like wanted me to have this new shiny thing that I would enjoy, right? That was the mindset behind it, right? That was the appeal of the PS2, is that it was like the mainstream thing. And what happened, right? They sat around collecting dust. People had like entire shelves of sports games that they never played, right? New games came out and were like quickly forgotten, right? PS2 was not a relevant video game platform. Even back then, I noticed this, but everyone was playing Nintendo games or Xbox games. PlayStation 2 had a handful of like RPG series that people like, Kingdom Hearts, Final Fantasy, uh, but that was about it, right? There were good games on PS2, but when you compare it to just how excited people would get over Super Smash Bros. Melee or Pikmin or Luigi's Mansion, like the reality is clear that the GameCube was absolutely more popular as a video game console. People actually played video games on the Nintendo GameCube. And that is why there is such a weird dissonance between the alleged sales numbers of the PS2, which are completely fake, by the way, and the enduring legacy and relevancy of the Nintendo GameCube, right? Wind Waker and Twilight Princess were huge success stories, right? Twilight Princess became one of the highest selling Zelda games ever and received a highly successful re-release on Nintendo Wii U. And now people are demanding a re-release on the Switch, right? Super Smash Bros. Melee is the game that kicked off Super Smash Bros. Quest to become the most popular fighting game in the world, right? You had all these great games, Killer 7, Beautiful Joe, like Pikmin, right? Wave Race, Blue Sport. Like you had all of this good stuff that people loved, that people played, that people enjoyed, that simply cannot be stripped away by banging on about sales numbers, right? The reality is people played the GameCube far more than they ever played the PS2. And that became extremely apparent by the time the next generation rolled around, right? Game journals were like completely baffled by this when it happened. They really thought the PS3 was going to come out and stop everything and like force Nintendo to go third party the way they did with Sega. There were articles about it. They were bragging about this, like the GameCube will the follow up to the GameCube will be less successful than it was, right? PlayStation is going to stop. There's no reason to even buy other consoles. PlayStation 3 is going to stop all of them. And Sony released the PS3 at 600 US dollars and it completely bombed, right? We dominated that console generation. We established the Nintendo brand to all people of all walks of life. Nintendo's change in strategy for that generation, built off of the success of the Nintendo GameCube, really, really showcased just how the PlayStation methodology of like throwing out overpowered, expensive hardware while paying for all the third party support was not viable in the long run. You know, Nintendo putting out the Wii proved that PlayStation and Xbox was doomed to failure. And at the time, nobody wanted to admit it. Like people did this thing where they pretended the Wii was just a fluke and that it wasn't really popular, that it wasn't successful. The same thing they tried to avoid talking about when it comes to the PS2. And when the Wii U came out, people had been successfully gaslit into thinking that the Wii brand was not viable, that it was going to lose its relevancy, that it wasn't successful, and that led to like the decline of popularity of the Wii U. But the Wii U was so successful that the Switch came out. The Switch shattered sales expectations because of Nintendo's very smart decision to promote their games through the Nintendo Direct service rather than through traditional Nintendo game journal outlets, right? Game journals were no longer able to manipulate people's opinions on what to think about video game consoles. And that has led to the current reality where it's no longer taboo to talk about how much you enjoy Nintendo products. Because back in the day, whenever you would talk about this stuff, it's like, oh, but I read in Game Informer that Nintendo is selling the least out of the three consoles. Well, okay, but how does that impact my personal enjoyment of the GameCube at all, right? Nobody was ever able to like answer that simple question, right? How exactly does Nintendo selling more or less than the competition stop them from being better than the competition? And that's the reality. That's the issue we have going into the next console generation. Seeing like the Switch is in the second half of its lifespan, is that people really religiously believe that the next console is going to be some kind of massive failure when in reality, it simply isn't possible at this point. The Nintendo brand is too well established. People love the characters. They love the games. Like, people are going to come out and play them no matter what. Right? That is what we've learned over the past decade, especially after the Wii U, is that Nintendo is going to put out high quality hardware and software no matter what. And as the narrative against them declines, as it continues to crumble, more and more people are going to be there on day one supporting this console and its games. There is nothing PlayStation or anyone else can do to establish a new PS2. There will be VR couldn't do it, the iPhone couldn't do it. Gaming PCs can't do it. The reality is that there is always going to be room in people's homes for Nintendo hardware. And the next several years are going to demonstrate that fact very, very well.